Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. Really, really excited for this roundtable conversation. I have two of just my favorite guests that I've had on this podcast before, Dr. Gaven Kerr, Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. Now, this is the first time that you two are interacting, but I mean, I've had conversations with both of you many times, and I really do mean it. Two of my favorite people to talk to. So very excited to have us all together here, and I want to thank you both for taking the time to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's an honor.
Yeah. So I was thinking, both of you have, been involved heavily in philosophy of religion and thinking about the nature of ultimate reality and God, but you kind of take slightly different approaches. So I thought it might be fun to kind of talk about the different approaches to God and see some of the similarities and differences and maybe advantages and disadvantages and even in just conversation and facilitating understanding. But then Gaven and I were actually talking earlier today, Josh, about something I know that you've thought about and worked on, and that's this idea of the gap problem, right? And very quickly, the gap problem arises in relation to some arguments for God, which have kind of like a stage one, and stage one is trying to get to some type of like uncaused or unconditioned or necessary reality. And then the gap kind of comes in there of trying to show why this could be or must be God as traditionally understood. And I was telling Gaven, I'm like, oh, well, this is convenient time to talk about this because this is something that Josh thinks about, right? So maybe we could just open the conversation there, and just kind of talk about the different approaches. I know this is the first time that you guys have engaged with one another, so wherever it goes, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, well, I'd be very curious, Gavin, to hear kind of how you approach it. I'm not familiar with your strategies or how you think about it. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, Gaven, is the gap problem really? Is it a problem for your approach? Why don't you give us your general sketch of and I know you've done it on the podcast before, but let's just assume that that's never been said, and then we'll just jam from there.
All right. So I suppose, I mean, what I'm discovering more and more, and what I'm finding out more and more, the more I engage with critics of Thomism and people who approach philosophy of religion as a field rather than making claims which would find their way into philosophy of religion, but they're claims which occur in metaphysics or epistemology, is that the Thomist approach to the existence of God and the approach that I've defended previously is that we demonstrate God's existence as a piece of metaphysical reasoning. And what I mean about that is that when we do metaphysics, when we try and think through the nature of being and what it is to be, we end up affirming a primary cause of being. We're led to affirm that. This happens classically in Aquinas' thought, something I've engaged with quite a bit, when Aquinas makes the distinction between essence and existence, and he considers how essence and existence relate to each other as potency and act. So existence is the principle of actuality by which any essence exists. And then he puts that into a causal context such that insofar as existence is not a result of the intrinsic nature of the thing, it doesn't flow from a thing's essence, because if the essence, given the distinction of essence and existence, the essence doesn't even exist in order for existence to flow from it. It must be a result of some extrinsic principle. And then Thomas feeds that into his whole metaphysics of per se ordered series, which is such that the members of those series, they don't possess essentially the causality of the series in question, so that unless there is some cause in which they can participate which does have the causality of the series per se or essentially, they would be without the causality in question. And so existence as a kind of causality is locatable in per se ordered series, and so we terminate in a primary cause, which is pure existence itself. That's generally the strategy that Thomas takes. That's the strategy he takes in the De Ente et Essentia. More generally, he's thinking about actuality, which is the actuality rooted in existence, but in different sort of arguments. He's just thinking about, actuality per se, such as in the first, second, third, fourth, and I would suggest fifth ways. Arguments from the De Potentia, from the commentary on the sentences, even from his commentary in John's Gospel. All of those, he's thinking about actuality, but it's actuality rooted in existence. And that's the general Thomist approach to God. But what I've been finding is that a lot of people who engage in philosophy of religion as a field seem to presume that we come to arguments for God's existence on the basis of a kind of a neutral approach. that any premise which is found within an argument for God's existence has to be treated neutrally and not read within the context of a background metaphysics. Now, this isn't something I'm attributing to you, Josh. It's with other people that I've been engaged with, particularly critics of Aquinas, who hold that we can't read arguments for God within a background metaphysics, and so they throw in these problems such as existential inertia. It's been a big one at the minute, that we have to remain neutral on the existential inertia issue, whereas in Aquinas it's not even an issue because it's an impossibility given the Thomist metaphysics. Some other objections, to say the first way I've been reading, and one of them has been, the gap argument. And the gap argument, is, how do we get, from a primary mover or an unmoved mover to God? Well, if, something like the first way is read, within that metaphysical backdrop, that what's at stake here is actuality, and an unmoved mover is that which is responsible for just actuality per se, then an unmoved mover is actual, okay, because it's a mover, and so it brings about the actuality of other things, but it's not itself caused in its actuality because it's an unmoved mover. So given that, then what we have is something which is just pure actuality. And if it's pure actuality, then it can't be any sort of, naturalistic thing or some sort of just Aristotelian first mover, which still needs its, motivation for moving explained and so on and so forth. And in other words, what we have is we have an independent primary source of all that is. So there isn't really a gap there, because once we get to a primary source for all that is, we have a creator. And then we can start doing, what comes after that, which is, think about, well, what would it be like for this thing to be, source of all that is, pure actuality, and then we deduce the divine attributes. But at least with the conclusion from the argument, we have a source without which there would be nothing. And so we're at, I would claim, we're at God already with that, and a gap I don't think opens up there. That would tend to be the Thomist approach to the matter, so that, whenever these sort of the issue of the gap argument, for instance, comes up, the Thomist kind of just thinks, well, why is that an issue? It's not an issue for us, given the metaphysics that we build into this argument. What do you make of that approach, Josh?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because it seems like there's maybe two parts to the approach. So one part is the argument for this kind of purely actual thing, and then teasing out its attributes based on this background metaphysics. So there's the argument. And then there's this kind of maybe epistemology. And it's interesting because, Gavin, while you're talking, I was thinking about a sort of problem that I see in the dialectic and the conversations between those who might sort of externalize their view and sort of treat it as the objective third person proof. It's like every rational person must believe this, versus a kind of first person approach where you just sort of ask yourself, well, does this seem true to me given my background considerations, my concepts, and if it seems true to me, then it might rationally move me to a conclusion, even if it doesn't have to rationally move others. And I almost actually wonder if your distinction between those who would sort of be thinking of it as neutral steps versus those who might recognize that, well, there's background packages in play that are part of it. I was actually wondering if that might even intersect or come to sort of the same thing that I was thinking about, but just in different terms. Because here's a worry, and I'd be curious to hear what both of you guys think about this. A worry that I hear sometimes that people express, I think this is a legitimate worry, is they would feel like somebody who's coming up with an argument is sometimes kind of presenting it so confidently, like this is a proof. And I've heard this specifically as a criticism of Thomists, that Thomists are saying we have a metaphysical demonstration of God's existence. And it sort of sounds like now, in order for you to be rational, you have to agree with us. And then sort of what I hear some of the skeptics saying is like, but wait a minute, like I don't share your intuitions, or I don't buy into your metaphysics. If we look at this as a neutral, agnostic who isn't already in your metaphysics, I don't have to be persuaded. And then you might come back and say, yeah, my point is not that anybody has to be persuaded. It's that if you share these background metaphysical systems and you find them plausible, and you might find them plausible after wrestling with them or coming into them, at a certain length of time. Oh, you might not though. So you're not claiming that you must. Then you have kind of a gentler approach where you're just saying, here's how things seem to me. They don't have to seem this way to you. What do you think about that as kind of like an epistemology of approaching these arguments?
Yeah. So two things I would want to say there. The first thing I would want to say is that from my point of view, in presenting what I would say is a demonstration of God's existence, and so I would want to say that it is a proof. I don't want to say that for somebody who isn't convinced of that proof, they're irrational and they can have no rational contribution to the debate. I know that Graham Oppy has taken issue with some people who have said that an atheist, has no rational engagement here because they don't accept the conclusion of the proof. I don't want to say that, because I think being rational and irrational doesn't pertain to accepting the conclusion of a demonstration. Rather, I think it pertains to following one's reasons and seeing where those reasons go. Now, one could just be misguided in the premises that one takes to be true, but I mean that's a different issue. That's a matter, of grasping the truth of a set of premises. I think that's distinct from being reasonable or rational about something. So that's the first thing I want to say. So somebody who doesn't accept the conclusion, I'm not saying that they're being irrational. I would just say that they're wrong.
I want to hear the second thing. I also want to come back and hear a little more about what you mean by demonstration.
Right. Okay. So the second thing then is, I think that, in metaphysics, we can make demonstrations. And, this is what you want to chat about. So we'll get chatting about that we can make demonstrations and that we can arrive at the truth of the matter in metaphysics. Usually requires an awful lot, of back and forth. But I think that can be done. And I think that when we do that, then we can get demonstrations for God's existence. If somebody disagrees, then I think instead of the person disagreeing, asking, oh, well, how do you demonstrate and how does this, that, or the other happen? I would actually just want to see where the disagreement is. If we both accept that we can engage in a rational conversation, let's not engage in a rational conversation about the meta philosophy or the philosophy of philosophy. But, let's just get into the nitty gritty of the argument and see where the problem is.
Which premise is that makes sense.
I do have, sort of thoughts about the philosophy of philosophy and, the nature of metaphysics and how we make demonstrations, which, you want to get into. But I mean, part of it,
I'd be curious just to know what you mean. Like, what does the word demonstration mean?
Okay. So, I mean, I take demonstration just in, the paradigm case, I think, is the Aristotelian syllogism. We have true premises, which, when fed into, the proper logic of the syllogism, leads to a conclusion. I think that's the ideal type of demonstration that we can have. I mean, I think we can have other demonstrations as well. We can have inductive inferences, so long as we have a good account for, how we get over, the problem of induction, or so long as we don't accept, an empiricist account of an induction, that we, retain a more sort of moderate, even critical realist sort of view of how we know the essences or the natures of things in the world. I think we can, make inductive generalizations, given that we can have, well, I would argue we can have an insight into the nature of things. And so if we can make these inductive inferences, form premises on the basis of those, and then, by deduction, arrive at a conclusion, I think we can form those sorts of demonstrations in metaphysics. That would be the ideal kind of demonstration for me.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think maybe the reason why I'm curious about this and what I sort of see at stake maybe is certain stumbling blocks of the argument based on presentation. So I was just thinking, like, sometimes I've heard people say that, Professor Rasmussen has made a mistake and we can demonstrate his mistake. And that feels different to me than when they say, Professor Rasmussen's argument has a premise and I actually don't find that premise intuitive, but Professor Rasmussen says he finds it intuitive. So we have a kind of a disagreement over whether that premise is true, but we both parties are in a sense justified from their own perspective. And it feels like if I say, and I'm not disagreeing with your proposal that there are demonstrations. Pat and I've talked about this. Pat, I think you might remember one of the first things you asked me about my argument was whether I thought it was a demonstration, that it actually counted. I don't know if you remember that.
I do.
You remember that? And I've thought about that question actually since then, because I wonder, well, what do I mean by demonstration?
And Josh, I remember you specifically said, like, there came a moment for you where you just saw, right? You saw from your perspective,
from my perspective,
with perfect clarity that this, and I think you're pretty strong in your case that this had to be the case. Like, it was a very, and that, whatever you want to call that sounded kind of like a yes to my question in a way. Right?
Yeah. And so then I thought maybe we could characterize it this way. So a demonstration would be a sequence of steps where it's possible to see the truth of each of the steps. Maybe there could be a degree of clarity, and some of those things that seemed perfectly clear at one time, like I can lose that clarity because I'm not thinking about it. Then I have to come back and maybe it becomes clear again. Do you have to have perfect clarity? So let me just give an example. I think kind of helps to illustrate this, and we can come back to the gap problem. I was actually thinking earlier today, I was talking with my wife, Rachel. We talked about philosophy. I was talking about how there are certain cases where it seems like very clear that one thing implies another. And then other cases, maybe it's not so clear, but the structure of reasoning is the same. And so I was using the example of a square circle. And I asked my wife, I said, Rachel, is a square circle impossible? And she said, yeah, that's impossible. I said, well, why? How do you know that? And so we talked about that for a while. And ultimately what she said was that it entails a contradiction. But then my question was, how do you know it entails a contradiction? Because being square and being circular isn't itself in the form of A and not A. Now you might say, well, being circular implies not having four sides, and being square implies having four sides. But it's not even part of the definition of being a circle. Not having four sides is not part of the definition. Rather, not having four sides follows from the definition, okay? So there's this sort of principle of reason by which you can just see that if there were a square circle, then there would be a contradiction. And then an additional principle of reason by which I think you can just see that a contradiction can't be true. Then you put those principles together and you can just see that there can't be a square circle. Now, I trust that like probably everybody who's watching this, whether they believe in God or not, will probably grant that if anything counts as a demonstration, this counts as a demonstration, that there can't be square circles. It's proof by contradiction, okay? However, and I think this might serve your thought, Gavin, if I'm understanding it, that this doesn't imply that you would be irrational if you disagreed with the demonstration. Because, I mean, there are all sorts of, I was reviewing a manuscript for Oxford University Press where they were making an argument for fictionalism with respect to any truths about abstracta. And so I think applying their argument, they might have reason to be skeptical even about this inference. And they would say it's actually false. It would be true given certain metaphysical assumptions or semantic assumptions. So there's a way in which you can become skeptical, even of something that maybe would be this clear. So then translating this over to an argument for God, maybe what we could say is that you might think there's a demonstration for God if you think that it's possible to be clear that each premise is true. Maybe this is just another way of saying it's possible to know that each premise is true.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Gavin?
Does that seem fair?
So one of the thoughts that was occurring to me, I would have my own thoughts about, the squared circle business, but maybe one of the things I would like to draw you out on, Josh. Are you happy with Josh?
Yeah.
Sorry, because I know
I'm calling you Gavin, so it's only fair.
Oh, you can call me Gav. Gav's fine as well.
Oh, okay.
So how much that clarity that you talk about, how much is that response dependent? In other words, is it clarity for the reasoner who is reasoning his way through the demonstration? Is it that he needs to be clear? Yes. Or is it that the steps of the demonstration have to be clear regardless of whether the reasoner grasps their clarity?
Okay, good. That's a very powerful question. Yeah. So here's my view. And I could be wrong. So I feel a little bit nervous just to say this because I don't have a full.
We're just having fun here. I love exploring.
Yeah. And if I moved
we don't
off,
have to be committed to anything here.
If I moved off the view, I guess I shouldn't be nervous. That should be a great experience. My view would be that clarity is always relative to a person. So that if you talk about a proposition being like intrinsically clear, I would say there's no such thing. I would want to translate that. I would say it's clear because most people who think about it find it clear. And I understand, I've read of philosophers who say, no, there's a kind of clarity inside the proposition, sort of a self-evidence. But I translate that. So I don't think clarity is in the proposition. I think it's always person relative. What do you think?
My concern there is that it makes the subject, or it makes the person entertaining the proposition the measure of the intelligibility of the proposition. My worry there then is that the proposition itself, or the intelligibility that it expresses, is not the measure of our thought about it. And so,
what do you mean by intelligibility there?
Okay, so whenever we're in a state of knowing, whenever we characterize a state as a state of knowing, it's one that involves some sort of normative or conceptual content. So when I think about something in the world and I'm in a state of knowing that thing, my conceptual content allows me to pick out that thing as opposed to other things. But that conceptual content, because I'm not an idealist, that conceptual content is not a content that I create or that I bring about. It's a conceptual content which the object brings about in me, and it brings it about because it has an intelligible nature. It has an essence. So, I mean, translated into
that helps. That helps. So yeah, so I would agree that things can be intelligible in that sense, apart from my awareness or anybody's awareness. I mean, you might think God is aware of everything, but that's not really to the point. So it's sort of intrinsically intelligible. But then there's a question of whether the truth of the proposition about it is clearly true, and whether that clarity is internal to the proposition.
So this is where I think maybe we get into some of these epistemological issues that you said you're working on, and that I'd like to get talking to you about. Because if the paradigm of knowledge is propositional, so if the paradigm of knowledge is knowledge that P, then I think we're into problems, because I would contest that the content of a state of knowing is always propositional content.
I'm with you. I can allow for non-conceptual knowledge by acquaintance.
Oh no, I can't allow for non-conceptual, content of any kind.
Oh, because it's not content.
Well, yeah, exactly.
So I thought you were saying that you want there to be propositional knowledge and non-propositional knowledge.
Yeah, non-propositional yet conceptual.
Yeah, content. Conceptual. Oh, okay.
So I don't think there's any content which is non-conceptual. I think the conceptual is unbounded, so that when we come into contact with an object in the world, it engages, or it brings into operation certain conceptual episodes. And then at the ultimate extreme, at the level of judgment, we, assent to some proposition. But prior to that, we're dealing with conceptual content all the way down, right down to experience.
What about arguments? Would you say that those are built out of propositions?
In order to have an argument, yes, you have to, have propositions which, are presented for, assent in judgment.
Yeah. Well, so I'm thinking, if we're talking about a demonstration, I think of it, this is sort of my terminology. I think a demonstration is an argument, and an argument is a set of propositions. And so then I'm thinking that in order for a proposition to be clear, it's got to be clear to someone. So 2 + 2 = 4 is clear if it's clear to someone. Now, some propositions are sort of maybe easy for them to be clear to like most human beings, and some are more difficult. And so sort of the way that I think of different proofs is the reason why some of them are more controversial than others more has to do with sort of the ease by which, well, a few different reasons. One has to do with the ease by which human beings can get clear. Another reason is because there can be high stakes and there can be very polarized psychological forces, especially in politics. I mean, there are things I think you can get clear. It doesn't have to be that hard, but when the stakes are
Right.
high and people who make certain arguments are your enemy, it can
Yeah.
be difficult.
You know, just to bring it back down. By the way, this is super fascinating stuff. I really enjoyed this, but
Ground us, help us.
yeah. No, just to come back to the practical, because I think part of the concern you're bringing up, Josh, is on a practical level, right? And it's the idea that when you kind of have to massage people's expectations, right? In ways when it comes to having conversations about God, because when most people hear, I think, who might not be familiar with these types of conversations or philosophy of religion in general, that you've got a demonstration or proof, I think they expect like you're going to give them a 2 + 2 = 4, and like it's going to compel them to assent, right? Or something
And
like that.
easily. And if it doesn't, if you
Right.
find one rational person who has a question, then it doesn't work. The argument is
Right.
baloney.
And I think we would all agree that if that's your expectation, we need to massage that. Right. And
Yeah, and if I could just add, because I really do care, I think a lot about this, is I think sometimes people are resisting arguments being used as sort of vehicles for control. Like, you disagree with me, well, I can prove to you with this demonstration that I'm right. And I really I feel like I come on both sides of that, where I can see an argument being used for something I think is true. And it's easier for me to maybe think, oh, this is cool, this is a pathway of reason. But then when somebody uses an argument against something that I think is true, and they present it as a demonstration, it's kind of what you said, Pat, about it's almost like, okay, massage my expectation here, because I'm feeling like you're trying to like control my mind, and you're saying if I don't agree with you, if I just have a different view, then you're going to just think that I'm irrational or ignorant, which is not what we're wanting to say here.
Right. And I think and I find myself in agreement really with all of this, in the sense that there is this massaging that expectation has to be done. And the real value in arguments, I know you said this before, Josh, and Gavin, I think you would agree with this, is it's a tool. It is a tool, right? To try and get at the truth of the matter. So I definitely want to say that, yeah, I think we can have a demonstration in the way that we've been talking about. But with both of you guys, I wouldn't say that if somebody doesn't see it, they're irrational or to be excluded from the conversation, right? Because there was a time when I didn't see it, right? Like I studied both your guys' works, and it took time for me to really grasp it. And the other thing I want to say is, because I studied both kind of, I guess, a traditional Thomistic metaphysical approach and Josh, some of your more contemporary stuff, I actually found a lot of value and mutual clarification between the projects. And I'll kind of give one example. So Josh, and maybe we could talk about this. I want to allow you guys to wrap up any of the threads previously if we want to circle back to that. But Josh, you have this argument from limits, right? And the argument from limits is really trying to move past the gap problem, in a sense, right? But then I studied Thomistic metaphysics, and I understand the argument of the real distinction. I'm like, these are actually very similar.
Structurally the same, yeah.
Very similar, but they're different enough that they actually, I would argue, they actually reinforce each other in cool ways. And that makes me feel even more confident about the conclusion, in a sense, to say like, oh, look, we have these kind of two different tools. They are structurally similar, but they're also different enough, right? And they converge upon the same conclusions. So I see value in that. I see a lot of value in that. So I'm going to pause there. I'll let you guys go and close any threads that you want to previously, but then I would want to actually maybe dive a little bit deeper into the real distinction and your argument from limits and stuff like that.
If I may just close one thread quickly, it's that I just want to affirm that I think somebody can see even everything that I take myself to see, and still not agree with me. And I kind of have to say this because there are certain people who've come very close to me, and I'm convinced that they are swimming in my epistemic structures, and they're seeing, of course they don't see everything that I see, but I have to just say, I think it's possible to see all the things that I see and still have good reasons to be skeptical, even if in the end, I think that I'm seeing something that's true. So I hope I'm not being overly charitable, but I just have this, I'm not being overly charitable. I just want to say this because I just know that these conversations can get very complex, and people can come into a place and they can understand things very well. And I don't want to suggest that the disagreement is only because I know more than you do. And I guess I just care enough. I just want to say that. So
maybe so one of the things, one of the reasons why I kind of was eager to take our conversation down that issue of propositional and non-propositional content is because I think it feeds into how we do metaphysics. Because if there is conceptual content, if you know the realm of the conceptual is unbounded, and we can still be realists in affirming that. So, you know, you're probably familiar with the whole Macdaulian, you know, sort of account of that in the Pittsburgh school. If the conceptual is unbounded and propositional content is a specification of the conceptual content, which we have from the ground level up, then I would want to say that clarity is a feature of that content as derived from the world as brought into view by means of our, you know, perceptual, cognitional capacities. So that whenever we have propositions which are clear, it's not in virtue of how we specify those propositions or of how we react to those propositions. In other words, it's not us being clear about the propositions. It's about the propositions being a clear manifestation of what the nature of reality is. If that can be the case, and I mean, I suppose maybe later in the conversation, I would like to get chatting to you about, you know, your work at the minute on minds and consciousness, you know, and how it ties in with this. If that can be the case, then we can form clear propositions about reality and just not be clear on them at all. Just not be, you know, aware of what's going on here. And it would take some effort on our part to kind of, you know, conform our thinking to that. And I think maybe that's where that, you know, when we say that somebody has a bit further to go to sort of grasp the argument, it's because they need to become clear on, you know, the argumentation itself, rather than the argumentation having to, you know, something having to happen to the argumentation in order to convince someone. So I suppose that's why I sort of brought it down that alleyway, because I think there are moves in, you know, epistemology and philosophy of mind that are made here, which lie under the surface of these sorts of arguments and the kind of conclusions we want to, you know, get out of these arguments. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. Actually, I was just thinking that what you're saying, it might be like the argument. It's like a mirror, and the mirror is sort of clear insofar as it's representing reality. It's mirroring reality.
Yeah.
And that's a clarity like in the mirror, which is representing the clarity of reality, even if somebody doesn't see the mirror.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I'm sort of translating what you're saying in a way that is congruent, I think, with what I'd want to say as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Look at that. Philosophical progress can be made.
This is possible.
It actually happens. About that.
When we're in rapport and we have respect for each other and we're not trying to win, right?
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. So can we talk about, because I definitely want to get to the mind stuff, Josh, because I know it's
argument. Let's
mind.
do argument from limits. That's what you want to talk about a little bit, and then the mind stuff. Yeah.
So why don't you just sketch it out? Obviously, you don't have to do all the details, but just to get it on the table, and then I'd love just to explore how it connects with some of what Gaven has written.
Yeah. So it's interesting, Gaven, when you were talking about this sort of argument for a first cause that's purely actual, and you said if it was purely actual, it wouldn't be a natural object. Okay. And I was sort of thinking of my naturalist friends, and I actually have a book on is God the best explanation of things? It's a dialogue. And toward the end of the book, I offer a version of theism, a version of the existence of God that I call it supreme naturalism, because it actually takes that initial object, says, oh, maybe it is a natural object. It's supreme in its nature. Now, maybe that's just an abuse of the term natural, and I don't want to, fight over words. But a question I think that I would have is, why think this initial object, even if it's purely actual, has a supreme nature? Like why would it be a being than which no greater could be thought or possible, right? Why would it be a being that would be worth worshiping or honoring? Why would it have all knowledge? Why would it have all power? And that's where this sort of argument from limits comes in. I was sort of extending a kind of familiar path of reasoning where we explain things out as far as we can. We look at objects in the world and we think, oh, what could explain those objects? And it seems to me that if we're going to arrive at some original entity that has no further explanation, then there's got to be some kind of like relevant difference between the explained and the unexplained. You know, like what would make this the kind of thing that couldn't be further explained? You might say, well, maybe it's a purely actual turtle. It's like, well, no, it couldn't be. See, this is what you're thinking, Gavin. This is on your mind. It couldn't be a turtle if it's purely actual, right? But why not? Well, you say, well, because if it was a turtle, it'd have potentiality. Well, why would it have potentiality? Why couldn't it just be necessarily the case that has those turtle shapes with no potential for different shapes?
I don't like the term necessarily there.
Okay, well, you know, why it's purely actually those shapes, and it has no potential for different shapes, right? And I think an answer to that, at least to my mind, and you can illuminate this in your system, is that the difference between shape, triangle, circle, turtle shape, just doesn't seem like it's gonna be a relevant difference for with respect to having a further explanation, or even the possibility of a further explanation. So it seems like you could always further explain turtles, which is why if there is an original unexplained thing, it wouldn't be a turtle. So this is kind of my argument from limits, is the idea is that anything that's limited in some way is going to differ from other limited things in ways that don't make the difference between the explained and the unexplained. So therefore, ultimate reality is going to have a supreme nature, which is the kind of nature that doesn't entail arbitrary limits. That's the idea.
No, that's very good. That reminds me of a principle in Thomas that unreceived act is unlimited. So any specification of actuality is received actuality or limited actuality.
Specification. So that's good.
So the turtle is some sort of specification of actuality. And if the turtle as a specification of actuality were conceived of as pure actuality, then it would have to exclude all non-turtle forms of actuality. So any actual things after the turtle would just be specifications of turtle actuality. It would be species of turtle in a sense. So as to allow for the multiplicity of things, to allow for non-turtle actualities, that which is pure actuality can't be identical to any of those specifications. Or from what I'm understanding on your account, anything which is to any degree limited can't be, you know, the extent of limitation, or that which is unlimited from which all the limited derives. Would that be a good representation of your point? Yeah. So, I mean, definitely, I see in, you know, the sort of Thomas view, unreceived act is unlimited, you know, a convergence here with your own account.
Yeah. And Pat, remind us that argument from Father Spencer.
Yeah, Robert Spitzer. Yeah, so he's good because he kind of, I see him as kind of a bridge between you two in a sense, and which I appreciate for, again, if nothing else, for just pedagogical reasons, right? I think that seeing these different approaches can help bring clarity to each approach, right? So like Josh, for your argument from limits, there just seems something kind of intuitive about it. Like, things that are sort of bounded, that some sense kind of like run up against a restriction on their intelligibility.
That was
restricted.
His term, right?
That's Spitzer, right? Is restrictions, right, on being, actually block out other beings. So to go to your square circle example, Spitzer, he wants to say that the, you know, principle of non-contradiction is it's an ontological principle, right? The boundaries on being of one thing necessarily block out the boundaries of being on something else. So in order to have an explanation for any restricted, finite, qualitatively finite reality, you're going to need something that's going to be compatible with all of that, right? And so he gets back to just an unrestricted active understanding, the classic idea of a thought thinking itself. And if the fundamental reality were a turtle that were restricted, those boundaries of being would fundamentally be exclusive.
And something would have to then restrict it. Something would have to be prior to it to restrict it.
Right.
So
and it would block out. It couldn't ground anything. And it's kind of what Gavin's at. So you kind of see the harmony here of any other reality. That, you know, anything that would be incompatible with a turtle as the fundamental reality, which would probably be a lot of things, right, couldn't exist. right? Because
Yeah,
it couldn't have its conditions for existence fulfilled by a turtle.
by a turtle.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's funny because I heard Spencer's argument. He was on the radio. He came on the radio, and he was giving this argument for this unconditioned condition for everything else. And I was thinking, oh, this argument actually sounds very much like the argument that I give for a foundation of everything else. He wasn't giving an argument for a finite chain. It wasn't his argument. It was this argument that take the totality of reality. There's nothing outside of it. And so he was using the same argument. Take the totality of the conditions. That totality has no condition beyond it. And so he argues for an unconditioned condition of everything else on the basis of this. And I'm thinking, wow, that really sounds familiar. And I was actually thinking, did he read my book? Like this is sounding like my argument. And then he goes on to that second stage, that gap, to fill the gap. And he makes this argument from restrictions and saying all these restricted things need a restrictor. And because differences in restriction aren't going to be relevant to a difference with respect to having no need for an explanation or cause or condition. So therefore, the unconditioned condition of everything else has to be an unrestricted reality. And I thought, well, this is structurally the same as my argument from the first cause having no arbitrary limits, because all limits would have further causes and conditions. And so I do think there's different arguments in different traditions that if you, this is my conviction on this, and people can disagree with this, but it seems like if you follow the light of reason, if you really pay attention within these different frames, you'll end up with a kind of convergence from those different frames. Right. And that at first you might not recognize the convergence because they're worded in different language. Like the Thomists use all their language, and so you don't recognize that there's a convergence. But I have to believe that like reason leads to like truth. And so it's not going to contradict itself.
Right. And the one thing, again, that I'll just emphasize, and then Gavin, I want to get some more of your thoughts on this, is yeah, I mean, it's just cool to see that convergence, right? Like it's actually kind of striking, and it's something that still strikes me even now. I'll discover, I think, a new frame every now and then that will shine clarity on other things. Like, there were times when I'm like, I'm wrestling with the deeper, metaphysics, and it was actually reading kind of people who stepped outside of the tradition a little bit, like Father Spitzer, who he's a Jesuit, so he's definitely like Thomistic friendly. I don't know if he considers himself a Thomist, but then you, Josh, too, and just like the way you guys come at it actually helped me to better understand what Thomas was saying. Like it brought clarity over there, and things started to click. So again, I think there's value in seeing the convergence and whatever you want to draw from that, but there's also value as just a pedagogical device too. I think it really, for me anyways, me, I'm just kind of dumber, so sometimes I need multiple approaches to get something right. But Gavin, any further thoughts on any of this?
The immediate thing there, when you guys were talking, and we were just seeing this convergence that, in Thomist terms, any specification of actuality is dependent on that which is pure actuality, or what is through another is reducible to what is per se, or what is limited is kind of dependent on that which is unlimited or unbounded. I'm reminded of Whitehead's History of Western Philosophy as footnotes to Plato, and the move that seems to be being made here is that which exists in a participated sort of way is reduced to that which participates in nothing. So the overarching principle in which everything participates, the unbounded, that's just pure act, unmoved mover, all of that. It's a very Platonic sort of move. The unlimited and the perfect in Platonism is the immaterial. Well, it's the form, and it's most perfect. Whereas in Aristotelianism, the unlimited is prime matter, which is most imperfect, which is pure potency. Aristotelianism isn't friendly to this sort of move here, whereas it's this sort of Platonism, that Platonic move from what's dependent and limited, depending on and participating in what's independent and what's unlimited. And that runs throughout Thomism, which unfortunately, given the Aristotelian terminology, people don't see, and Thomas is explicit in a number of places. The Platonists got it right. The Platonists got it right when it comes to God. They didn't get it right when it comes to the forms, but they got it right when it comes to God. And he says that so many times. And this sort of Platonic reasoning, if not explicitly Platonic, is being found in the sort of arguments that you guys are putting forth as well. So my initial thought is, the convergence of these traditions sort of just shows the forcefulness of the kind of Platonic worldview. Joss, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, no, that's good. I was going to just say, the convergence would, I think, occur in the best versions of the views. And then the idea is that reason helps you to figure out which views are inferior. And so certain interpretations of the views will fall by the wayside. But that's an interesting point, Gavin, about the idea that you have a kind of Platonic core that shows up in the sort of conclusion of the ultimate, having sort of, in my terms, a nature. You say purely actual. It's not a pure nothingness, or it's a pure something, and it has all the resources for everything else. And you need to have something like that. I mean, and I was actually just thinking that maybe it's kind of helpful to have the language of like pure actuality or pure perfection, rather even than being unbounded or unlimited. And the reason for that is because when you think of the unbounded, at least for me, it's almost like I'm starting with my concept of bounded things, and then I'm adding them up to infinity. And so I actually have like an infinite number of bounded things, or I have an infinite extended space or something like that. And it's like, well, that's not really the concept of a perfect being. I mean, perfect being is not an infinite being in the sense that you take something finite and you just pull it out to infinity. It's more like you subtract and remove all the restrictions, all the boundaries, all the potential, all of that. And then what's left is something pure, maybe even simple, it's just this pure perfection. And then that provides the anchor for everything else.
Yeah. And I think that's important because it designates a kind of theism, or a way of thinking about theism, which is being attacked quite a bit today in philosophical circles. I mean, people refer to it as classical theism. I mean, I don't like that term because there is no
feel under attack, Gavin? Are you taking this attack personally?
No,
just teasing, just poking you a little bit.
I mean, I was joking with Pat earlier that there is no such thing as the classical theist. So there isn't, classical theism, but because we see these Platonic tendencies running throughout a lot of what people would call classical theism, the idea that, all that is dependent, depends on what is independent in itself. That stands in significant contrast to non-classical accounts of theism, where, the God on that account isn't quite independent in himself. He depends on creation in some way because he has some sort of real relation. He's co-variable with creation. His knowledge changes and mutates with creation. He's one way before he creates and a different way after he creates. All those things, which
I like some of those things. There might be some. Maybe another time we can have a little bit of a tension conversation about that. I actually kind of like some of those real changes.
Oh well, maybe we could have it now if you want.
Hey, it's hot off in the presses right now. If you guys have the time to engage it a little bit.
Yeah. So I mean, I sort of like to have a wide range of options to a conclusion that I think would be significant. So I hate to push off options, but I mean, my view would be that I have a kind of dynamic view of time, where things that exist now, if there is a now. And my view, time proceeds from change. So as long as there's changing things, and there's a now. Since I think God exists, I think God exists now. And this does, I think, imply some kind of real relations. Now, maybe there's a friendly translation where God is intrinsically timeless, but extrinsically temporally related. But on this account, God would change in his awareness of what is presently the case. Wonderful. So if I raise my hand, God's knowledge of the hand being raised is different than in the past.
Wonderful. Great. Lovely stuff. Right. So what I want to agree with there, I think the account of time, I mean, we could get into that, but I want to say, the now exists, and time is measured by succession, or the time piggybacks on succession and change. So if you don't have succession and change, you don't have time.
I'm with you on that. Yeah.
So I want to agree with that. And I want to agree that creatures can change. And there's all different ways in which creatures could be. But I don't want to agree that God's knowledge of creatures changes with the change of creatures. And here's why. If God's knowledge would change with creatures, if God's knowledge of creatures were dependent on some sort of conceptual content, which is a direct manifestation of those creatures. So let's say when I know a tree, I have the concept of a tree, and that's how I pick out that tree. That's how I come to terms with it. When God knows that tree, he doesn't have the concept of a tree. The conceptual content that by which he knows the tree is the divine essence itself.
Hold on. So are you saying God's knowledge of the tree is non-conceptual?
No, it's conceptual.
Okay, so he does have a conceptual contact with the tree.
But the conceptual content isn't the concept of a tree. The conceptual content is the divine essence itself. It's the divine essence by which he knows the tree. It's not a concept of a tree by which he knows it.
So just to clarify, I have a metaphysical demonstration that you're wrong. Okay. I'm just playing with you here.
Okay.
I don't know. I actually probably don't. But just to clarify, is the idea that God's knowledge of the tree is the same knowledge as his knowledge of a rock, or are those different knowledges?
God's knowledge is of the divine essence, and in knowing the divine essence, he knows the rock and the tree and anything else.
Okay, and then his divine essence, you'd say, I think is simple, doesn't have distinction. I guess maybe where I get lost is like, well, how does he distinguish the rock, the knowledge of the rock, from the knowledge of the tree, if both knowledges are mediated through the knowledge of one undifferentiated essence with no distinctions within it? It's maybe there's a translation here, but it's almost like going back to the mirror. It's almost like, well, God's knowledge is like a mirror of reality. And so that if there's distinctions in reality, there's going to be distinctions in the mirror.
So several things you can say here. You talked earlier about just seeing, kind of a demonstration on its component parts. So you just grasp in a single insight all the different component parts of a demonstration. Now that insight isn't the several insights by which the demonstration is grasped. It's just a single insight where you see it. And, we do this all the time when we when we do logic, propositional calculus, you see a sequent and you just see how the sequent is resolved. And then you do the whole, premise, modus ponens, tollens, all of that. But, you can just see the sequent and see the solution to it. Or, you can just see the truth table if you're good at logic or whatever. So I would say God's knowledge of the divine essence is like that. He can just see the truths about other things just in seeing the divine essence. Now, technically speaking, what we mean here is that in knowing a divine essence, he knows his power perfectly. And so he knows anything which could be a result of that power. So he knows anything which could come to be. But intelligibly speaking, his seeing everything in the divine essence is like being able just to see, a demonstration the way you described earlier, just in a single insight.
If I know, sorry, if I may, I just have like one follow-up, but go ahead, Pat. I think you wanted to.
No, because it's just very fascinating hearing this exchange, because I often want to say, well, maybe there's a bridge here. And don't get me wrong, like sometimes I think it's good just to have like disagreement. It's one side or the other. But I was just curious because Gavin and I have been talking about this, and Josh, I know that you're friends, and I don't know how regularly you talk with Alex Proust, but I like somebody like Matthews Grant's extrinsic model of divine simplicity. And I wonder if that might serve a bridge here, because I think that might allow us to say that, in God's understanding of himself, he understands in one perfect act all the ways that thing could participate in being. But then if God knows a tree, his knowledge is in a sense, at least in I don't know if you would agree with this, Josh, it is the cause of the tree, right? So he really does know the tree, and that's a change on the side of the creature, but that's an extrinsic predication. And at least the way I think about it, that type of predication, that type of change is compatible with divine simplicity and this or that. So I think that gives us a lot of what we might call contingent latitude or stuff like that. And it seems like that might be compatible both with what you're saying and with what Gavin's saying.
Yeah. No, this is
Or
actually
it's a model we could put out there that I think might serve as a bridge, not in an ad hoc way, but the way I'm hearing both of you talk about this, I'm like, seems like this might be, because I'm not sure I disagree with anything either of you two are saying. I just kind of see the different perspectives
Well,
you're coming at
it's
it,
interesting because, Pat, this is exactly what this was going to be my next thought or question was, could we sort of bring the views together where sort of intrinsically God has one single act of awareness by which he can see many things.
Mm-hmm.
And the many is external to God. It's out there in the world. And as the many changes, that doesn't mean that God changes intrinsically.
Mm-hmm.
I think a question that would remain for me is, how do you characterize the relationship between God and those things?
Right.
So one thing that I would hear sometimes people say is like, well, God doesn't have any real relations that change. And there it might just be a matter of translation, but I'm not really sure how to even understand that. I mean, let's say you just take the relation of a coexistence. So God coexists with me and I'm annihilated. And then God doesn't coexist with me. It's not intrinsic change. It's purely in a change in the world.
Yeah. So I think, John, if I could just one more thing about that, and then I'll let Gavin get in, is the way I think, well, I have Grant's book fresh in my mind. So, and then I'll let Gavin chime in, but he would say when we're talking about real relations there, it's just that there's no real foundation in God. For that, that the relationship is just the effect, call it E, existing, and its causal dependence on God.
Yeah.
And the effects can differ, right, across all possible worlds we want to do it, but God would remain essentially the same. And Grant's cool on this. The reason I like Grant is he shows that this actually supports libertarian freedom, right? Because there's no factor both logically prior to and sufficient for the effect. So there's a sort of counterfactual power there that if you're a libertarian, you're probably going to like that. If you're not a libertarian, then maybe not. But a lot of what Grant's project is doing with the extrinsic model is to show that if you have this mixed relations, right, where you the creature is really related to God, but God is just rationally related to the creature, we can push to contingency extrinsic. We can preserve divine simplicity in the way that most of us are thinking about it here. And we can have our libertarian cake and eat it too, which is,
no, I love that. That's a beautiful translation. I mean, that would be something that I would resonate with.
Yeah. Now, Gavin, I'm not sure if there's anything you would disagree with any of that or anything you'd want to add. I am trying to be a bridge builder here.
Let's see. Well, the first thing I would maybe want to say is Grant's book arrived at my desk 2 days ago, so I've yet to read it. So I have to sit down and read it.
You said you have read it, Josh?
No, I have not. So I appreciate your little synopsis there.
It's this one, by the way.
Oh yeah, that's it. Yeah,
it's called Free Will and God's Universal Causality, Dual Sources, for the interested listener.
So I think a lot of this turns on the doctrine of mixed relations, that God has a logical relation to creatures and creatures have a real relation to God. The reason why creatures have a real relation to God is because there's a foundation in the creature by which they are related to God, such that you remove that foundation, you remove the creature. And that's, on the Thomist account, that's the act of existence, which creatures enjoy. And without that, the creature ceases to be. But there's no foundation in God which relates gods to creatures, such that if that foundation were to disappear, God would be in some way different. What I would want to argue is that God is just being, well, pure actuality, pure existence itself. When he brings about creatures, he not only makes use of his knowledge, but he makes use of his will and his power, so that any creature which is brought about not only because God, sort of sees a possible manifestation of, being or actuality, but he wills it to be so, and in willing it to be so, he brings it about. Now, God's power is not a principle of his acting in the way that, let's say, well, I mean, Pat and I are gym goers. We like to go to the gym. We have power to lift a certain amount of weight, and then that'll be a principle for our actually lifting that weight. It's not like that in God. God's power isn't a principle of his acting. It's a power of the thing. It's a principle of the thing produced. In other words, a principle of, the creature by which the creature exists. So it's not the case that prior to the creature existing, God's power isn't doing anything, and then after the creature's existing, God's power is doing something. Rather, God's power simply has an extrinsic effect when creatures are brought about, thereby signifying no change in God before and after creation. So all in all, what I would want to say here is that God is always alone. There is, the kind of, relate to a recent article, there is no alone world, contrasted with, the non-alone world. God just is alone, which is God's transcendent. Creatures are not alone. Creatures exist with God, but God doesn't exist with creatures. So regardless of whether or not creatures exist, God always remains just as he is, as pure existence itself. And so when it comes to God's knowledge, then, because God has knowledge by the divine essence and not some conceptual content drawn from creatures, God knows then which creatures are related to his power and which creatures aren't related to his power, because he has perfect knowledge of his power. And that doesn't change with the variability of creatures. How does that sit?
I think that sorry, just go ahead and follow up. I was going to say that could be a wonderful thing to explore in 10 different conversations, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was just going to say something simple, which is I appreciate that. I was just thinking that I think there are different ways of interpreting that. And I was finding myself thinking sort of in Pat's way of like, okay, is there a interpretation, a kind of bridge building interpretation that is congruent with things that I think are true? And it seems like I think there probably is, and so there are ways of interpreting that where it's like, oh, I don't know if that's true or not. But this is, I think, one of the maybe even more important than sort of figuring out those particular details to me is kind of how you approach these big questions in a way that you personally can have a kind of productive journey to see more and more. And then if you're in a position of influence, you can help others have a productive journey where they're seeing more. It's not necessarily even the case that they're seeing more of what you personally see, but they're getting more powers to see things for themselves. And it seems like one of the principles is to look for the most charitable interpretation you can find. And it might even be that it wasn't even an interpretation that was intended, but it actually extends the view in a positive direction. It might be that it was the interpretation that was intended, and you're more likely to find that interpretation if you're charitable. And I find that that's very helpful. It's really helped me to see, we talked about convergence, how very different views can then work as kind of like tension devices. Wisdom flows through tension, I think. And so they work as kind of tension devices. And then as you're looking for the most charitable version of the one view and the most charitable version of the other, you do sort of find your way towards a kind of interesting convergence in my experience.
Yeah. The other thing, Josh, and this is something I think I first got from you. If not, I'm just going to give you credit for it anyways. But I know, I'm pretty sure it was you. And it's such a good principle is that, look, a lot of this stuff is really hard, right? It's really, really hard. But we should use what is clear as much as possible to shine light on what is unclear.
Yeah.
And I think, right, that was from you, Josh, I think, right?
It was, no, I've been calling this the flashlight principle.
Yeah.
And you look for what's the clearest, and then you let that extend your light.
Right. And we shouldn't let what is unclear just allow us to arbitrarily reject the things that were clear before, because there is unclarity, right? And I think that's something that people do is like, you get to this point of unclarity, you're not sure, there's challenges, there's tensions, and then like, they throw their hands up and they get rid of everything. Well, no, that stuff was clear. Don't get rid of that.
Absolutely, yes. Well, especially like if you're in this dark cave and all your friends are in this dark cave and somebody says, no, actually, here's a flashlight. And you're like, wait a minute. If that flashlight works, then this cave isn't dark. Therefore, that flashlight can't work. Because what are you saying? That we actually could see things in here? No, there's controversy. The reason there's controversy is that we can't see. And I appreciate that. I mean, but if you personally are taking a light, and you see that it actually does shine in that cave, maybe the right thing to do is just to go take that light further into the cave rather than run out of the cave and say, well, this light can't work in there because it's dark in there.
Right.
It's like, no, you have a light. So maybe you can see things in there that you couldn't see before. Maybe that's a possibility.
Right. And the cool thing about a number of these, difficulties and challenges with the unclear area, and let's just like label like when we get to God, right? Because I think with a number of these arguments, like we kind of want to say like, yeah, we really feel like we have got to God, but it's just like barely a fingertips grasp, right? It's very unclear. The challenges and the criticism, I think, can be helpful because it can I think help us to want to shine the flashlight or try to shine the flashlight in certain areas to see, can we investigate this more? Can we learn more? And maybe at some point we can't, right? At some point there really is just a mystery that we just can't pass it. But why not try, right? Why not try? Why not try? Why not keep trying? I don't know how that connects to everything that you guys have been talking about, but it just popped in my head.
It's sort of useful for making progress. I mean, I was even thinking, Gavin, when you were talking, I appreciated something you did was you took something that I had earlier said in the conversation about knowledge, and then you used that later and said, take that concept that you mentioned earlier, apply that to God's knowledge, and you can see how God could have this kind of intuition. And it was like, well, that was very helpful because you took something that was already clear to me, and then you use that to make clear, a view that you were expressing. And I think that is a way to make progress. You look for the clear and then you extend from there.
Yeah, very good. So this has been awesome. I know we want to talk about persons. Josh, how are you on time? Is that your beautiful family I hear in the background?
I've got my kids coming in here. I'm good. I mean,
you guys good to keep going for a little bit?
Yeah, I'm good. It's only getting close to midnight here, so
Yeah, well, I know you've got the stamina all night. I'm like a 9 o'clock bedtime kind of guy. I don't know how you do it. Okay, so and we could circle back to any of this more later if we want, but I think that's actually really helpful because I think again, genuine progress was made there, and clarity was kind of put on the perspectives, and I think what you find is that sometimes you might start at a position where you think that there's substantial disagreement, and you realize actually no, there's more harmony here than we initially thought.
Maybe just to point out the cool thing, that happens there is, whenever Josh, you were saying, oh, well, we might have a few things to say there, but maybe we could get into it later, and it was like, well, let's do it now. Let's get into it. I mean, I think that's how these sorts of discussions have to move forward by. Yeah. Instead of people saying, "Oh, well, we'll just agree to disagree," it's, "Well, no, we'll not. Let's talk through the disagreement and see where."
I love the tension, and I think it's helpful to think about wisdom as flowing from the tension. I think that helps to motivate people, and I think it also helps when you understand how to have a productive conversation with attention. I think if it's always polarizing, then you never want to do it unless you just love, feeling outraged or whatever, but
well, that's what I appreciate about both of you guys. And that's what I knew, like, I gotta have this conversation because I don't know if Josh and Gavin agree on everything. I would imagine there's things they don't disagree on, but I know
we don't.
But when I know they do disagree, I know they'll be able to have a great exchange. And you guys have definitely proven that so far. And I put that out there because I think it is an amazing model. And you're right, because the tension there can be tension and it can be fun. Right. It doesn't have to be. That's right. Like sometimes people hear the word tension, or they hear the word argument outside of, but like philosophers, Josh, you say this a lot, like it's a love language.
It's our love language. Yeah.
Right. That's what philosophers, arguments are a good thing for philosophers. Tension is a good thing. So very cool. All right. So let's now, Josh, let's go back to the gap thing again. And Gavin, I know you've been thinking a lot about persons and mind and world as well. So this will be interesting. One way that you've attempted to kind of bridge the gap, so to speak, Josh, is just thinking about consciousness and some of the implications thereof. So you've been thinking about this a lot more recently because I know you're working on a new book. So yeah, what do you have for us? Let's put something out there and let's have some fun with it.
Yeah, well, we had a whole episode on consciousness before, and I talked about tools that you have to investigate your consciousness. You have this kind of introspection by which you can sort of pay attention to your inner world. And it's so fascinating as I'm writing the book. It's like I'm seeing all the more the treasures within and the power that you have to explore that. It's like you take for granted the things that are familiar, like your thoughts and your feelings. They're so familiar. You sort of wake up having thoughts and feelings, but like, don't mistake the familiar for the insignificant. You can hardly overemphasize the significance of consciousness. Like without consciousness, you have no hopes, no desires, you have no thought about significance. It's like, there's just nothing. Like everything comes through your consciousness. Like all your knowledge comes through consciousness, experience. And then when you investigate consciousness, it's like, well, there's a sense in which it's a mystery. It's sort of great to say, the mystery of consciousness. It's one of those dark caves, but then there's this cool flashlight you have that you can take with you into that cave. And there's multiple tools, multiple flashlights, but one of them right here that I'm thinking about is this power to pay attention through introspection. Sometimes people say, "Oh, what's introspection?" Introspection is something that you can't really trust or whatever. But the thing is that if you actually start using introspection to focus on your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, you can make distinctions. You can see that, oh, feeling happy is not the same as feeling sad. And without introspection, you couldn't make any distinctions like that. You couldn't even distinguish that this dream is different from another dream. I use the example of dreams because people say, well, dreams aren't based in reality. They're illusions, they're hallucinations. Like, okay, but you can still know things about experiences that don't match an outer world. Like you can know that one experience is different from another experience. And and that might sound like basic and trivial and obvious, but it's really not, because once you realize, oh, you can actually know some things with this power of introspection, then you're taking that flashlight in and you're thinking, okay, what else can I know? And so you can begin to pay attention to not just that you have consciousness and that consciousness is sort of different from time and place, but you can start thinking about, okay, what unifies my consciousness? I mean, you could imagine like a pile of leaves with each leaf having a different feeling. That's different than there being a person or a self or a conscious center that has all those feelings, right? So it's not just like my brain has all these different feelings. It's like there's also me, the one who has them. And so they're bound together. And one of the things that I'm doing in the book is I'm just starting by making observations. I'm collecting data. And so I tell the readers, I'm going to take a broadly scientific approach where we're going to just make observations with our tools. And then we're going to come up with hypotheses to see if we can account for those observations. And we're going to test those hypotheses by making more observations. So that's kind of the approach. And then the discovery, I mean, there's so many things to discover, but the discovery for me is that the first whole part of the book, part one, is showing that there are many parts of you that aren't reducible to material forms. So you've got thoughts, you've got feelings, you have value, you have choice capacity. And I have a chapter for each one of those, making the case that those aren't reducible to material forms. And then from there, I ask the question, well, then how did these things all come to exist if they're not reducible to material forms? And so then I look at how to account for consciousness. And it's not as simple as emergence. People say, oh, well, consciousness emerges. But when you focus in on consciousness, you try to figure, okay, well, what is this and how could it emerge? Then you find that there's constraints. Like you can't just get, the number 5 emerging from a water bottle or something, or like the thought that 2 + 2 = 4 emerging from a bunch of sand thrown into the wind. So some emergence just isn't possible. And my argument is not against emergence. My argument is about how do we best explain the emergence of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you would, maybe we jump and Gavin, chime in and push me aside at any minute here you want. So Josh, actually on a recent podcast, I was jamming around with another friend of ours, Jim Madden. I'm not sure if you've interacted with any of his stuff. And we actually were going back and forth on the identity argument. And he disagreed with it, right? So we had a good moment of tension. This was on somebody else's podcast.
Which one? Which
right? So it's one that a number of people make, but you're one of them, right? And so this might be a good jumping off point, right? I can be directly aware of my thoughts without being directly aware of my brain states. So it seems like we have something true of A that is not true of B. So for anybody who wants to say that A equals B, we've got a problem here, right?
Yeah.
And there's a number of typical objections. The Clark Kent or water objection are the two ones. And this is the one we were kind of jamming around. So maybe I will even put that one out there because the water one kind of ties into the emergence idea. And the idea is there's got to be something wrong with this argument in general, because I can be aware of water without being aware of H2O, right? Or once we have H2O, water emerges. So why couldn't this be the same case with consciousness and brain states? So since that was just a recent dialogue I had, I won't say what my responses were. I don't want to give you all the secrets. Not that I wasn't borrowing from you, Josh. Anyways, what would be? I don't know if that'd be a good jumping off point. And then if that's even the first argument you would want to use, and then I want to move like, okay, how does that connect to the foundation of reality? And then what would Gaven think of all this? So yeah, a lot of stuff there.
Yeah. So, I mean, in my book, I'm slowing everything down. And I think what I'm realizing is that just taking time to make distinctions make observations, really helps to lay the groundwork so that before I get to any arguments, you sort of preempt a lot of objections, because I really think a lot of these objections come from the fact that they're just different ways of interpreting the argument, and certain interpretations just aren't going to be good arguments. And so we got to get clear. I think it is helpful to start, with the clearest, like what's the clearest, right? And an example that I've given in previous writings is if you take a coin and you look at the front side of the coin and you notice that it's heads, okay, and then you turn it around, you see the back side, you see that it's tails. And somebody says, well, how do you know that the heads is not the same as the tails? Like, how do you know that? What's your argument for that? You say, well, it's a different shape. You could just look at it. Don't you see it's a different shape? And they come back and say, well, I mean, it seems to be a different shape, but how do you know you're not looking at the same shape from two different perspectives? How do you know that, right? And at some point, I think you do have a power to just see distinction in a basic way. Like you could just see that true and false aren't the same, or that square and circle aren't the same. Okay, I think ultimately that's the power you're going to have to rely on. But then you can build an argument using that power. So here's an argument. This is I call it the awareness argument. I can be aware of the heads of the coin without being aware of the tails of the coin. Okay, but if the heads is the tails, then by the law of identity, whatever's true of the heads is true of the tails. So if it's true that I'm aware of the heads, then if they're the same thing, then it's true that I'm aware of the tails. So therefore, if I can be aware of the heads without being aware of the tails, then it does follow that the heads and tails cannot be the same thing. Okay, I think that's a sound argument. Now, what about these parodies where they say, well, look, you can be aware of H2O without being aware of water, or you can be aware of water, that you're drinking water, but you don't know the molecular structure, what's going on there. I think in every one of those cases, you're not actually directly aware of the thing in question. So take the water example. When I'm aware of drinking water, there's kind of an ambiguity in what I mean by drinking water. Do I mean my experience? Okay, I'm directly aware of my experience of drinking water, but that's not the H2O molecule, right? So the argument does work. It shows that my experience of drinking water isn't the same as the H2O molecule. But if you say, no, what you mean by water is whatever it is that's causing the watery experience. The watery experience isn't the water. The water is whatever's causing it. Well, then I'm not tempted to say that I'm aware of what's causing me to have that experience, not in any kind of direct way, without being aware of H2O. There's no temptation to even believe that premise. And so I think that's where it's just a different argument. And so it doesn't really work, doesn't translate over. Mm-hmm. What you want to do is you want to look at cases where you're directly aware, like take, for example, I'm directly aware of my happiness. I'm feeling a state of happiness right now being with you guys. I'm aware of that. I'm not lying to you. This is just fun. I'm not aware of any kind of anger right now towards you guys. And so therefore, happiness and anger just can't be the same thing. Mm-hmm. And if you say that's not a good argument because of the water objection, I say that's just a different argument.
Right. Well, real quick, and I want Gavin's thoughts on that, is the morning and evening star got brought up too, right?
Yeah.
And this is,
that's the other one. Yeah.
They're the same thing, right? But there are really distinct properties there. There's a property of being appeared to in the morning versus being appeared to in the evening. Yeah. Right. So once we take that into account, there is something that really isn't the same. Right.
That's right. Yeah. That's the other thing that I like to say as well, is that the reason thank you for bringing that one too, because it's like the reason that you're even tempted to say that they're different is because there are differences that you're aware of.
Right.
Differences in the features that you're aware of, that rising the evening, rising in the morning.
And I guess the Aristotelian could come in and give an account of new forms with water and H2O and stuff like that too. But Gavin, what do you think of all this so far before we start trying to bridge the gap? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a few things. I mean, the two, first of all, I mean, the first thing I thought I was going to ask Josh about, but I'll not, is, can we know what it's like to be a bat? That's one thing. So Josh knows exactly what I'm referring to there. The other one is, you're talking about water. Nobody's mentioned Putnam and Twin Earth, yet the mental content externalism. But I think maybe where I kind of want to go with this is, and I've always been sympathetic to the identity argument, and I've never really much been moved. It was the Clark Kent counter example was the one that, we were always brought up on when looking at this. But maybe where I want to go with this is I kind of just want to, I want to draw you out, Josh, on the issue of consciousness. And I want to ask, is consciousness always of an object, or can you have an empty consciousness?
I don't really, I haven't fully made up my mind on that. I mean, so on some days I sort of have toyed with the idea that I understand what you're asking, that the conscious experience is always of something, some quality or something like this. But I can also sort of have that gestalt shift where I see it, it's the old woman, young woman sort of, it's like, oh, it's just this raw conscious experience, not really of anything. But I think maybe you're going to want to say, Gavin, that it is of, because of the conceptual thing that you want to bring into that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of Kantian when it comes to consciousness, and I think Kant is quite Aristotelian when it comes to consciousness. There's a kind of a thread in the history of philosophy, which is contrary to Descartes, and contrary to Hume to a certain extent, that doesn't want to hold that the consciousness is something that occurs within a privatized sort of space, that rather consciousness is always consciousness of something, and so has an intentionality to it. And so what consciousness is it's this ability that we have to unify a set of experiences so that we can be in a kind of special relation to the things of which we have an experience, which is called, an intentional relation, so that we become conscious of ourselves as consciousness only through differentiating ourselves from those things which are not conscious. And I think in that, you get a good argument for the immateriality of conscious life, precisely because if consciousness were any material thing, it wouldn't be able to stand in that relationship of always having an object, because material things kind of, have substantial being just in themselves. Like my brain can just have a substantial being in itself, whereas consciousness never has that sort of substantial being to it. I'm wondering, is that something you're sympathetic to?
Oh, I'm wondering, Kevin, if you can give a more modest version of that same argument, where you don't need to say that all consciousness is intentional. I mean, you can, right? But just for this argument for immaterial consciousness, you could say some consciousness is intentional, but then you could say that material objects are not intrinsically intentional. Would that kind of be your thought? I mean, and then that would be the premise that we could look at, that people might debate. They might say, well, maybe you could have a material object that's intrinsically intentional, but if you couldn't, then you've got your argument. And that argument, I think, would go through after that, even if not all consciousness is intentional. Does that seem right to you? Yeah.
And the reason why I would maybe want to go that direction is because I want to avoid completely a Cartesian view of mentality. That's something very much that I want to avoid. And I get a sense on the account that you're giving that you're not entirely Cartesian. You don't entirely seem to be convinced by Cartesianism, but then you say it's just sometimes you have a Gestalt shift where you can just have, consciousness even without an object.
Well, it's funny, the Cartesian, I sort of have this kind of joke that, like, if you beat up on Descartes' view, you get points in the academy, because like that's supposed to be like the very bad view, at least in certain circles. So I think for me, I mean, one of the things that is kind of characteristic of my style is I try to have a fresh approach where I come back to definitions later. So this is what I'm doing in my book as well, is I'm starting with observations, and then later, like towards the end of the book, I begin to give labels. Like, so now you could call this a Cartesian view, but now you know what I mean by this, right? Because that Cartesian view can be interpreted in different ways. But yeah, I mean, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say, because in my conversation I had with Jim, we spent a lot of time talking about what we think mind specifically isn't. And we spent very little time to talk about what we think it is. Right? Because for both of us, and I just like peek into philosophy of mind. It's by no means a specialty for me. I'm just very curious in it every now and then. that seems easier to me, like to do, right? Like it seems like take like James. I would be curious what you guys think of like Ross's argument, James Ross's argument, right? He focused on rationality,
With
that
the thoughts. Yeah.
yeah, that thoughts, formal thought content is it's not ambiguous, it's determinate, but any physical event or process can always be represented in other ways. It is ambiguous. And so he would argue that at least formal thinking processes, right, cannot be material or physical. Of course, given a certain conception of material or physical, but it's a very common one. And he argues for the immateriality that way. So that helps figure out what it's not. But it doesn't give you a complete account of human anthropology, does it? Right.
Well, it's interesting because I would even take a step further that the very functions, machine functions themselves aren't even shapes, or, see, I start to lose my grip. Like, what do you mean by material? I would argue that functions aren't themselves material features. So this is independent of Ross's argument. He would take a step further and say there's no sort of machine function. There's always a kind of indeterminacy about, like, which, 2 + 2 = 4, that thought, like, you can represent that using different functions. Is always indeterminate whether you've represented 2 + 2 = 4 or some functional equivalent. But I would say, put even that argument aside, the very functions themselves, I wouldn't analyze in terms of material features. But then this goes to, what do you even mean by materiality? And the funny thing is that, I think it is a good approach to say, okay, what's clear? That, my thought of cheese is not the same thing as cheese. Okay, so that's clear. My experience of love is not the same thing as a pineapple. Okay, that's clear. What can I say positively about these things? And this is where I think using that tool of introspection that I talked about, where you pay attention to the reality within your own consciousness, is actually one of your most powerful tools to see what consciousness is. In fact, I sort of have a way of characterizing dualism, or at least a certain form of it, where, like, dualism is the view that consciousness just is what it seems to be from the first person perspective and not something else. This kind of flips things on its head, because a lot of times people will object to dualism, saying, why are you positing beyond all the material stuff that we know about, this spooky extra stuff that we don't know about, that we can't say anything about? And I guess, I just think it's exactly the opposite, that what you know from your first person experience is the clearest thing that you know. And yeah, maybe there's some reason to deny that exists, or to say that it's actually something different than it seems to be. But it seems like the burden then should be on the person claiming that consciousness is not what it seems to be, not the person who says it is what it seems to be, and I'm not going to reduce it to something else.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Something that always struck me, when we're thinking about bat-like experience, is that there's something like that it's like to be in a subjective state, which, if we try to give it an objective account, we've lost the subjectivity of the state. Right? That's Nagel's argument. So, if I say that I'm in pain, and you say, well, you can't be in pain, your C fibers aren't firing, or, you don't have C fibers or whatever, I'll just say to you, well, shush, I'm in pain. To be in pain is to be in pain, regardless of what's happening in my C fibers. And, you get examples of phantom pain, of people who have lost limbs and stuff. They're in genuine pain, and even though they don't have a limb there for them to be in pain. And I think that's an example of, how consciousness, we just have to take it as it is, as a, first person subjective state. And that means that it's irreducible to objective scientific definition and explanation. I think the interesting point here is that how do we do an ontology on the basis of that? Do we read off an ontology from that, or do we say, look, this is made plausible on a basis of an ontology that we're already committed to, such as Aristotelian hylomorphism or something like that, that, on a hylomorphic view, we can accommodate, the first person subjectivity of consciousness. So rather than, reading an ontology off of the subjectivity of consciousness, just incorporating that subjectivity within an ontology that we already have. What do you think of that?
Well, what do you recommend between those options?
Well, I go for the Aristotelian view that I think we need an account of the being of things before we start investigating features of the beings that we have. And so, included in an account of the being of things, I think we need to give an account of the human being before we go into how do we explain the nature of consciousness. Then, if we already have a metaphysics of what it is to be human, then our whole account of consciousness can just slide right into that and fit in, and then we avoid all the sort of funny negative dualisms that are out there.
Okay. Yeah, I think I see what you mean. Yeah. So I think my approach would be to think of different hypotheses. And so the Aristotelian account would be a hypothesis, right? And then I'm just looking for the hypothesis that would best account for the data of experiences. So, and I don't think that the view that I arrive at, see, this is one of those things where when we're talking about this sort of the Thomism and these different arguments for an ultimate reality, a supreme reality, I think that it's interesting to how we have maybe different approaches that sort of arrive at a sort of structurally similar thing, but we might label them differently. So I'm not opposed to a kind of Aristotelian label. The terms that I would use would be, I would say that there's me. Okay. There's also you, so I'll give you that. There's not just me. And then the kind of being that you are, I'm going to assume, is the same as the kind of being that I am. And well, what is that kind of being? Well, it's the kind of being that can have first person experiential properties, that has value. And I'm going to, that has thoughts. I'm going to go through the list of features as a way of characterizing the being. And then that will leave open other questions. But of course, there are many questions you can ask about persons, right? And I think different hypotheses are actually addressing different questions. I think sometimes there's sort of this tendency in the philosophy of mind. I noticed this when I was in graduate school, to have sort of your standard set of views. And then you try to figure out which view is correct, and you argue for and against these views. And then maybe somebody comes up with this kind of interesting hybrid or extra view. But then it's interesting because as I started teaching in the philosophy of mind, and I was taking those existing categories and maybe even coming up with some new ones and just relaying them to students, as I actually had conversations with students, I think it kind of started to break my own frame of categorizing the views, because I realized that, well, those views maybe answer certain questions, but my students are asking other questions. And so what do you call a view that answers these questions, but not those questions? And so I kind of just like started over, like, let me just start over. Let's get all the pieces out and just build from scratch. Yeah.
That's really interesting that you mentioned that, because I don't think that's just philosophy of mind. I think that's almost every branch of philosophy, that, you're taught it with these different categories, and it's always opposing categories. And so you come to think of it that way. And then when you have to come to teach it yourself, you notice that, well, I mean, things are a wee bit more fine-grained here, and that you can appreciate insights from widely diverging philosophers. And my approach, I mean, as it's developed, has been to treat each philosopher individually rather than to just think about an ism and to categorize philosophers with that ism. So if I'm, engaging with Carnap or Quine, I'll engage with them as individuals and not try to sort of lump them under a common view. Well, it'd be difficult to do that with them too, but Carnap and Eyre, let's say, I'll see what's individual about them and sort of tease that out. And that's, I mean, the way I've come to sort of engage with students is to try and encourage students to do that rather than think in terms of these broad categories. So not just philosophy of mind that happens in. I think it's nearly every branch of philosophy we do that.
Well, that's I really appreciate both of what you're saying here, and it comes down to the isms and where it can be unhelpful. I guess I sometimes would call myself, I'm like broadly a Thomist, and the reason I say that is for a lot of what you two have just said is, sometimes I'll find a philosopher that I think is right or really resonates me, like a Lonergan or a Maritain on certain things, and somebody like, well, if you go with Maritain, he's against Garrigou, and now you're not a Thomist. I'm like, I'm out of the club. I'm out of the club.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I just don't think that's helpful, right? In many respects. And there's a lot that I like in Garrigou, but on certain issues, I would probably go with Lonergan or Maritain. But then other Lonergan of himself would say, well, I'm being true to Aquinas. And then you kind of get into these exegetical historical debates where I've always just been interested in what seems right, what seems
what
true.
is true. Yeah.
And then if this label, if people find this label acceptable to me or whatever, I'm fine. If not, they can get rid of it. And of course, I have huge admiration for Thomas, just as I have huge admiration for both of you two. And I read Josh's stuff. I'm like, wow, a lot of this seems really right and true. And I read Gavin's stuff. A lot of this seems really right and true. What does that make me? I have no idea.
A Rasmussenian. That's what it makes me.
a Rasmussenian. How about that?
That's right.
So that's very good. Okay. If you guys have to split at any time, I totally get it. But let's just say from here, whatever else we want to say about our model or categories of consciousness. Josh, what do you think is, how do we start to bridge the gap that we set out of this, at the beginning of this conversation? Once we start thinking about consciousness and the ways that we have and the foundation of reality. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So very briefly, I like to sort of think of a probability problem and a construction problem. So a probability problem is a problem of sort of predicting with any non-negligible probability that there be beings like us who can have an interesting conversation like this, who can think and wonder and reflect, have emotions and have adventures. We can imagine a mindless world with particles that scatter about. And we might even imagine with enough particles that through random chance, they produce machines that evolve to produce complex beings that look just like us, but don't have any feelings, right? No thoughts, no power to choose. And so it doesn't look to me that a purely mindless theory of the foundation of the first cause or the ultimate cause is going to predict conscious beings. It doesn't have that kind of predictive resource. Whereas if that fundamental reality, you shave off those arbitrary limits, it's got a supreme nature. So it's got power to produce the rest of the world, but its power is not arbitrarily limited. It's got supreme power, which I think conceptually is going to include the power of conscious production, because that's a possible power that would be, I think, included in supreme power. And this gives it predictive resources. It explains, I mean, if it has the power, if it's truly supreme, it doesn't have any arbitrary limits, I think it would have knowledge of good reasons to produce an interesting world where beings can come into adventures and relationships. So that's one. There's the prediction problem. I think theism provides resources for helping with that problem better than its competitors. People have to sort of investigate that on their own, test that out, see if that makes sense. Then there's this construction problem, which is the problem. This is basically what Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. David Chalmers is talking about how do you actually take some mindless Legos, put them together to produce not just a robot that acts like it's finding something funny, but it's literally having that feeling. Gavin, you mentioned what it's like to be a bat. Like it's having the feeling of what it's like to find something funny. Merely describing its shape, its geometry, its function, all that stuff doesn't seem to include that experiential element. And so the question is like, how in principle is it possible to construct first person consciousness? And here I think theism provides resources for that. Now I want to be careful. I don't want to be overly dogmatic here and say, well, there's no other possible way of constructing this. One of the things I do in the book is I focus on a very clear case of a plate. I might change the example. Right now I've written about a plate. And I say, you paint that plate red, and then you ask, is that plate happy now? Does the redness of the plate make you happy? And I consider different theories. Well, maybe redness is happiness, the identity theory. Or maybe redness determines or grounds or causes happiness to emerge, right? And I consider that, and I say, well, it seems like we actually don't think a red plate is happy. And well, why don't we think? I mean, you can't say the reason you don't think a red plate is happy is because it tells you that it's not happy. Maybe it is happy, it just has no vocal cords to tell you about its happiness. How could you rule that out? And yet you seem so sure that the red plate isn't happy. Why? And I would argue it's because you actually have a faculty. This isn't just introspection. I would call this reason, that you can see that redness is not the right material for happiness. And I start with that because I think it is a clear case. And then once you start with that, you start moving through all the colors. Does making it blue make it happy? No, blue makes it sad, right? Because it's blue. No, it doesn't. It doesn't become sad. You put a sad face into the plate. You draw a sad face. No, the shapes don't make it sad. And as far as I can tell, these differences in shape and color, you can actually see that they're not relevant differences. Differences in shape and color. Differences in function. Function is just a set of ordered inputs and outputs. And so you go from an input shape to an output shape. It starts red, it becomes blue. Does that make the plate happy? No, I think you can see that. And making it more complex. And this is where it takes work. You have to put your mind into this, do the work of thinking about it. Check, does it seem true that merely making the number of plates go up, or the complexity of the shape go up, or the complexity of the function go up? Would that make a difference? And then if not, well, then it looks like you do have a very deep puzzle for how you could ever construct consciousness purely from third person material resources. It's tricky because people say, well, look at brains. Brains produce consciousness. It's like, okay, brains belong to conscious beings. So if you already have a conscious being there, or a being that has the capacity for consciousness, then you don't have the same problem, because then changes to the structure can affect changes to the being that's already able to be conscious. But the whole question is, how do you get beings that can be conscious from scratch in the first place? It's not a question that you can sort of answer in this scientific way, because any answer you give scientifically is going to presuppose this deeper construction question about how in principle it's possible.
Yeah, Josh, before we get Gavin's thoughts, I'm just curious, because like, how much of this is just something that you just need to like stare at intellectually until you think maybe the scales fall from your eyes? You know what I mean? Because you like, this happened to me, and it's just like, okay, if whatever else reality is, if at bottom it's just some fundamental physical simple collection of disparate things that have no intentionality, no awareness, all these qualitative aspects that we associate with consciousness, it's not there, right?
And it doesn't even have the power to be conscious, or the power. It doesn't even have the capacity for awareness.
Right. And then okay, and then we can multiply those things. We can organize those things. We can put them in different configurations, different locations, and somehow they almost invert into their complete and perfect qualitative opposite. I don't know how else to say that I think that that's impossible. Like that just really does seem impossible to me.
It can just click for you. Yeah. And I want to be careful here, because
no, and again, I don't want to say like you're an idiot if you don't see that. Like,
no,
not what
well,
I'm saying.
and there's a kind of reverse. There's, the problem isn't just a qualitative leap, right? Because we do have this experience of, as a conscious being, okay, I can form a mental image in my mind, and that mental image is qualitatively different than me. Okay, now this bear with me here. Or if I form a thought, that thought, you might say, is qualitatively different than me. Or if you imagine God creating matter, okay, you might think, well, the material world is qualitatively different than God. So how did you go from the leap from the qualitative to this different thing? And what I hear you saying, Pat, is not that there's an in principle problem with creating qualitatively different things. It's that when you think specifically about these particular leaps,
these particular categories,
categories, from the mindless beads hitting each other or fields or whatever, to produce conscious, rational. It's not even just that it's conscious. Like in some cases, our thoughts are even rational, right? But they're based on mindless, non-rational causes. It's like there's something about that it can just sort of click for you, and you just say, no, that doesn't seem. And then, not only it doesn't seem probable, like it doesn't maybe even seem possible at all.
Yeah, I agree. And then with what you're saying, just to summarize your argument, and then with theism, if we think of God as just like the full plenitude of existence itself, even the matter thing, again, like how do you define matter, right? If you think of matter as just a principle of individualization and limitation, well, then if you think of God kind of thinking up the world, and he thinks, well, this exists and is like me, but in this finite way, and this exists and is like me in this particular restricted way, then we just have God, the fullness, and then a bunch of minuses, right?
Yeah.
Just a bunch of subtractions, right? And that doesn't seem impossible to me, right? Anyway, Gavin, your thoughts on all this?
Just what you were saying there at the end, that with God's production of things, you have God and just a bunch of minuses. Again, a very Platonic sort of way of thinking. and the idea that, reality creation is just some sort of lesser sort of participation within, the fullness, which is the divinity. Again, that's that Platonic theme that runs through it.
Mm-hmm.
But with regard to the philosophy of mind, I think that a lot of these discussions are captivated by a presupposition of atomism. And the idea here is that substances are constructed out of atoms, so that substance is nothing more than just an aggregate of atoms. And I mean, the history of philosophy of science, the whole problem here was that of emergence. How is it that a substance has, these properties that its atomic components don't have? And that's never really sort of in the scientific community. The only way that that was addressed was, well, let's talk about molecular properties then. So our atoms sort of bunch together and, they show molecular behavior, and, molecules exhibit properties that the atoms, their atoms don't possess. But that doesn't really sort of answer the metaphysical question, the problem of emergence. And I mean, even Leibniz realized that this was a problem, and he had to sort of revert to some sort of notion of a primary unifying atom, which gives us, these emergent properties. And in that, he was trying to get back to Aristotle's notion of substantial form. And it seems to me that unless you have an account of that there are formal features of a thing, and there are features that a thing possesses, not in virtue of its material components, but in virtue of the material components coming to be unified in that way, such as water being, H2O, the form that the hydrogen and oxygen take so as to produce water, so that water is wet and, can put out fire and so on, but hydrogen and oxygen themselves can't do that. Unless you have an account of formal properties, I don't think you're going to be able to answer the problem of emergence. So when it comes to consciousness, then, if you have an account of formal properties, consciousness is a formal property of a material substance and not just a constructed or emergent property of the thing. And if it's a formal property, then the form, or the Aristotelians say the substantial form of the thing, if it's a formal property, it's immaterial, then the form itself, which supports that property, has to be immaterial. And so it can't occur as a result of transformations of matter. It has to have a direct creation. It has to be directly created by God, and not just wrought out of, the interactions of matter. So I mean, that's the sort of view that I would take. And I think it consists well with Josh's view there, because from what I'm hearing from Josh is that in order to have consciousness, there is required some sort of, being, like God that produces consciousness. And it's not just the result of material interactions. How's that, Josh? How's that sound?
Yeah, no, that sounds right to me. I'm actually kind of curious. What do you think about the production of matter? Do you think that consciousness can produce matter, or what do you think about Pat's idea about matter being more like limitations in the divine substance or the divine being?
I think God can produce matter. I think the production of matter is simply an act of omnipotence. Okay. I don't think there's any sort of root or imitation in God of matter. I mean, the way things sort of imitate, God's divine ideas. Every individual is an imitation of that. I don't think there's anything like that in God. So I think because matter is a principle of potency and God is pure actuality, the production of matter then requires an act of omnipotence.
Yeah.
So I think No, I was just going to say, I think sometimes maybe when people think of, consciousness relating to God, I guess maybe I want to be careful here because there's obviously nuances to different schools of thought, right? That if God is just kind of a mind like we are a mind, you could see, okay, well, that seems difficult then to get matter in the kind of scientific materialism idea that we have matter. It does seem like we have a leap there. But I think there's a different paradigm that we're all kind of looking at this through where, well, God is just whatever else God, he's the fullness of existence as such. And now we're thinking of matter as, and whatever else the fullness of existence as such is, it could, it doesn't seem like there's an issue with God setting out restrictions, right? of saying, and if you think of matter as just kind of this boundedness, this principle of individualization or limitation or whatever. Now, I think that requires that maybe you have to have independent arguments for that type of paradigm shift. But for me, that seems it seems independently motivated, but it also seems just like more natural and intuitive than the kind of like just big idealism, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's kind of what you're getting at, Josh. Or
I'm trying to escape this light. It's sort of following me around here. But yeah, no, that I feel like that's very helpful. I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about is the way in which mind precedes matter, and that material forms can come from mind, emerge from mind. But then this leads to this question, like, well, what is matter? I mean, it's sort of interesting because it seems to me that I'm most familiar with consciousness, my experiences, mental imagery, thoughts, and things like this. And then matter is kind of like this posit that is to explain my experiences. So I sort of imagine that there's this stuff out there that has these causal powers or whatever. And if I don't fill in what that is, and I just sort of treat it as a kind of functional device that can explain my experiences, well, then it leaves open a wide range of theories. And so I would sort of follow reason where it leads. I mean, if it looks like there's a theory of matter on which there's a problem for how mind could produce matter, well, then since it seems like my mind is related to the external world in some way, then that will just shave off that theory of matter. Whereas if we go in the other direction and we start with sort of mindless things producing mind, here I think I'm more aware, like I have direct awareness of consciousness and of thoughts, and so then this is what kind of leads to that sort of construction problem, where I'm going to say, well, I just don't think you can get mind, reasoning, rational thought, consciousness from purely mindless foundations.
Let me say what I think the great value and overarching theme of this conversation is, and this has really been wonderful, guys. I can't thank you enough so far. Is that we have two very, very intelligent people here who have different procedures. I think it'd be fair to say that you guys have kind of different procedures in a way. And there may have along the way seem to be points of discord, but they seem to be mostly superficial discord. And what we find is that different procedures can illuminate each other in many ways. And very interestingly, they seem to converge upon a much deeper harmony. That's what struck me about this conversation so far. And I think that's awesome. I think that's really cool. I'd just love to get your guys maybe summary or anything else you want to throw out there. I mean, I could chat with you guys all night, but it's already past midnight with Gaven and Josh. I know you've got a family to tend to, so yeah.
This has been wonderful. It's been fun, and I feel like there's a kind of a theme where when there's tension, it creates opportunity for greater insight. And I've even thought like the more tension, the more the opportunity. It seems like in marriages are sort of like this. It's like my friends where there's the most fire and tension in their marriage. It seems like when they work through that tension, they have like the most passionate relationships. And I think there's something about worldview development that's like that, where if you have a question and you get some people together and they look at the question with different tools from different angles, and there's some tension there, I think it does create an opportunity for more insight. And I certainly feel like that took place in this conversation.
Cool. Gaven, any summary final thoughts here? And then before we go, I definitely want to hear about the current projects you both are working on.
Yeah. I suppose my MO in philosophy has always been to just read everything and try and situate myself in it, in my own thoughts. I've always been very impressed by, the scholastic method of just, objections, replies, and trying to take what's best in everything. And Gilson's point that in philosophy, it's not a case of, the true and the false and the contrast between those. It's a case of the contrast between the more or the less true. So I think convergence is inevitable in philosophy, and especially if we've arrived at the truth of the matter, it can't be the case that, discord is anything more than superficial. And so I think we kind of see in that come out, given our different sort of intuitions about how we arrive at God and creation, mind and world. There are various intuitions and moves that we're sort of making here, which seem to mimic each other, and we're trying to arrive at the same sort of endpoint. Me with my sort of scholastic, Kantian infused scholasticism, should we call it, and Josh and his own procedures, where we seem to become aiming at the same target, but in different ways. And it's been highlighted in the various convergences that we've had, which is it's cool to see.
Yeah, very cool. All right, so let's finish with this, with your further resources. Josh, you've got a very cool new project that you are launching. So please take as much time as you want to announce this, let people know what it's all about and how they can get involved.
Yeah, sure. So my wife and I, we started this group called the Worldview Design Training Center. It's for anybody who's sort of obsessed with trying to understand the sort of the big questions of life. And we made this for Christians. It's a resource for Christians to connect with Christian philosophers, ministry leaders, public influencers who are really thinking a lot about the existence of God, the nature of God. And it's kind of like we're all there together having conversations to help each other see more, to expand our understanding. And I've had a lot of people come in and find that it's a resource that provides them encouragement. One of the things I'm working on now is to create a video lecture course. And there are other philosophers in there who are interested in making video lecture courses for people in the group. So if anybody's interested in that, go to worldview-design.com and you can find out more about that.
I will link it in the show notes. And Josh is underselling it, friends. It is I got the privilege of an early peek, and it is an incredible community with really awesome discussion. So if you've made it to the end of this conversation, that is something you definitely want to check out. Gavin, you've always got a ton in the pipeline. What are you currently working on, and should people be keeping an eye out for?
Yes, so I've got a load of articles in submission at the minute. I've kind of had a bit of a flurry of activity recently. But I've been working on an article on the fourth way, an article on the first way, an article on the third way. They're all, well underway, nearly finished. I've got an article that I'm working on tacit knowledge and God. So tacit knowledge is this idea that, whenever you do things sort of expertly, you do it by means of tacit knowledge. So you do it knowingly because you're an expert at it, but you don't do it sort of, reflectively, consciously, but you're still deploying knowledge. And so I'm constructing an account of God's knowledge, which, maintains that God's knowledge is more like tacit knowledge rather than our more self-reflective, knowing that P is the case or something like that. So I'm working on that. I'm also writing a book with a co-author on the 5 ways. Speaking to my co-author here, Pat. So we're writing a book on the 5 ways together, a nice introductory text on that. So that's being written. And, so over the course of the year, that's going to be done. And my book on the resurrection, I've sort of made the decision to incorporate the material that I've been writing on the resurrection into a larger study of Aquinas's natural theology as a whole and Aquinas's defense of classical theism, even though I've just repudiated, the notion that we can have classical theism. So the material on the resurrection, it's just made more sense, to precede it just with a study of Aquinas's classical theism, of his natural theology, a defense of that, and then how the whole account of the resurrection, as the perfection of man and thus the perfection of creation kind of crowns all of Thomas's natural theology. So that's morphed in now into this larger project, which I'm working on, but getting a lot of traction in that. And then we've got this big conference. Well, we've got a conference coming up at St. Patrick's on the future of Christian metaphysics. That's at the end of April. So we've got Jennifer Martin, John Betts, Lorella Conjuncti, and Tim Paul all speaking at that with responses. And then we've got our huge conference in 2022 with all of our big thinkers, Patrick Lee, Robert George, Eleanor Stump, Julia Klima, all those, big names. They're going to be at St. Patrick's next year. Very cool. That's what I've got ahead of me. Oh, and I'm teaching several courses this year at St. Patrick's, undergrad and postgrad. So staying busy.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you again to both so much. This has just been an awesome time. We're gonna have a big show notes page, so we'll link the Josh's resources and websites over there. We'll link Gavin's stuff, and I'm gonna link a bunch of previous conversations I had both with Gavin and Josh before. And I would encourage the listeners, go and listen to the different procedures and the separate conversations, but look out for the convergence, and I think you'll find a lot of cool stuff there. So, gentlemen, thank you again so much.
Thank you. It was great.